Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Inhofe, distinguished committee members, good morning. I'm pleased to testify with General Dickinson today and appreciate the collaborative efforts our commands undertake in the defense of the nation. I thank the President, Secretary of Defense Austin, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Milley for their leadership and support to the mission of strategic deterrence. I assure you the command is committed to work the priorities set forth by the Secretary to defend the nation, take care of our people, and succeed through teamwork. We succeed each and every day through the teamwork of 150,000 men and women performing STRATCOM's missions, and I remind the command it is our diversity, resilience, and professionalism that sets us apart and makes us even stronger. It is truly a privilege to represent them here today. I also thank the committee for its enduring support to our national defense and active engagement and interest in the command's missions. Strategic deterrence enables every U.S. military operation around the world. Every operational plan in the department and every other capability we possess rests on an assumption that strategic deterrence, and in particular nuclear deterrence, is holding. If that fails, nothing else in the Department of Defense works as planned. STRATCOM sets the most foundational of operating conditions to allow the rest of the joint force to accomplish its mission. And as a nation, I'd assert until recently, we have not fully considered the implications of engaging in competition through crisis or possible direct armed conflict with a nuclear-capable adversary in nearly 3 decades. For the first time in our history, the nation is facing 2 nuclear-capable strategic peer adversaries at the same time, both of whom have to be deterred differently. Chinese and Russian advances are eroding our conventional and strategic deterrence. China, in particular, I submit, cannot be considered anymore a lesser included case in this context. The remarkable expansion of nuclear and strategic capability is evidence of their drive to be a strategic peer by the end of the decade. I would describe this as the strategic complement to the conventional capability growth that's been reported by Indo-PACOM. To me, they are at some kind of an inflection point and are rapidly expanding their strategic capabilities. This has happened within the last year. They are well ahead of the pace to double their stockpile by the end of the decade. And I further submit that the size of a nation's weapons stockpile by itself is a very crude measure of what they can do with that capability. To fully assess the China threat, it's necessary to consider the capability, range, accuracy of the delivery systems, command and control, readiness, posture, doctrine, and training. In the very near term, China will possess a credible nuclear triad, rapidly expanding road mobile capability. And these are intercontinental ballistic missiles on trucks that they drive around. It's a big country that can be hard to find. They're moving to solid fuel intercontinental ballistic missiles, silo-based, very responsive compared to a liquid fuel one. They're deploying a strategic bomber, and they possess now 6 second-generation GEN-class ballistic missile submarines, and they're capable of continuous at-sea deterrent patrol. Developing a dedicated nuclear command and control capability that includes launch under warning and launch under attack. By these measures, China is capable of executing any plausible nuclear employment strategy regionally now, and will soon be able to do so at intercontinental ranges. I offer for China it is important to look at what they do, not what they say, and where they're going, not where they are. And I have no choice but to view China as a significant strategic threat and share Secretary Austin's assessment that China is the pacing threat for the nation and DoD at large. Russia, however, remains the pacing nuclear strategic threat, aggressively engaged conventional and nuclear capability development, modernization, and are now roughly 80% complete, while we are at 0. It is easier to describe what they're not modernizing, nothing, than what they are, which is pretty much everything, including several never-before-seen capabilities and several thousand non-treaty accountable weapon systems. They have a nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missile that has the avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle, Poseidon nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed underwater vehicle, and the Skyfall nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed cruise missiles, examples of asymmetric strategic weapons capabilities designed to deter us and our allies, offset perceived conventional inferiority in an effort to terminate events on Russian terms. So given all that, We can no longer assume the risk of a strategic deterrence failure in crisis or conflict is always low. The days of power projection in a permissive operational environment without regard to a possible nuclear response are over. This is why, as Secretary Austin testified during his confirmation, nuclear deterrence is our highest priority. Given that threat, the nation requires a fully modernized strategic force and supporting infrastructure. Every presidential administration over the past 60 years has reaffirmed a safe, secure, effective nuclear force. Most credible combinations of capabilities to deter strategic attack assure allies. Each element has unique capabilities, but it's the combined elements of the triad that allow us to execute our assigned national strategy. We're at a point where end-of-life limitations and cumulative effects of underinvestment in our nuclear deterrent and supporting infrastructure against the expanding threat leave me no operational margin. The nation simply cannot attempt to indefinitely life extend leftover Cold War weapons systems and successfully carry out the assigned strategy. They're at risk of losing credibility in the eyes of our adversaries, and if they continue to work at all, they will likely not be able to face the threat that they're intended to deter. I'll just end with, in particular, it's the nuclear weapons stockpile and supporting infrastructure I think is hitting the wall first. Without the recapitalization of the existing weapons, we risk obsolescence and irrelevance, and we could reach a point where no amount of money will adequately mitigate the operational risks we'll be facing. Final point, the nation has a long-standing, flexible, tailored strategy with a well-thought-out family of policies, capabilities, and postures. I welcome and call for a strategic review, but I advise against any individual policy or capability decision made absent a complete understanding of the overall effects on that strategy, as it could risk a deterrence failure, which is the underpinning of everything we do. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you again for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. Admiral Richard, I'd like to thank you for your honesty and your bluntness of your opening statement in explaining the expanding nuclear programs of both China and Russia. Last week, the Strategic Forces Subcommittee held a classified briefing on these threats, and yet we continue to hear renewed calls for unilateral cuts to our nuclear forces, abandoning the triad, and delaying or canceling modernization programs. Sir, are you aware of any intelligence or threat assessments that would support these courses of action?
Senator, I am not. In fact, the threat is only getting worse rapidly.
So it is your view that taking such actions would reduce our ability to deter the threats that we face?
Senator, yes.
Microphone.
Senator, yes. And it's not just the nuclear component. Part of what I'm trying to show is the relationship in all of our elements of national power and how nuclear underpins that.
What about the future? Because, as you know, the impact of cutting modernization programs now, it wouldn't be felt until the 2030s, when our force begins to age out, as you spoke about, and replacements aren't ready. Do you see any reason to believe that the world is going to be a lot safer in 2030 and we won't need a viable deterrent then?
Senator, I see no indications of that. That will be an unprecedented threat that we face in 2030. Hopefully, perhaps we can change that trajectory, but I can't count on hope in terms of having the capabilities needed to do my mission.
Admiral Richard, what are your views on the current distribution of warheads across the three legs of our triad? Right now, we see about 70% of our treaty-accountable warheads. They're on our submarines, and if we significantly can cut the ICBM leg, as some advocates have urged, what number would go up further? And of course, our bombers are not on alert. Do you think there are risks with leaning too heavily on one part of the triad?
Senator, the answer is yes, and I'll give you just one example of that. What is not often recognized is we don't have a triad day to day, right? The bombers are not available to us. We chose to take them off alert as a type of peace dividend after the Cold War. So day to day, all you have is basically a dyad. Basic design criteria in the triad is that you cannot allow a failure of any one leg of the triad to prevent you from being able to do everything the President has ordered you to do that. If you don't have intercontinental ballistic missiles, we can't meet that criteria. You are completely dependent on the submarine leg. And I've already told the Secretary of Defense that under those conditions, I would request to re-alert the bombers.
And sir, you've also talked about counting the number of strategic nuclear warheads a nation has. That can be a crude way to measure their capability. Your posture statement mentions this as well. Can you elaborate on why this is such an incomplete way to assess an adversary, and talk a little bit about the other elements that we need to also be considering?
Senator, fundamentally, you don't deter by accounting. We don't hold up cards and say, I have more, I win. It is important to know what they can do with that capability to understand operationally the threat that you face. It is important to remember that both Russia and China have a unilateral ability to go to any level of violence that they choose to if they perceive that the stakes are high enough. And there is a point beyond which unlimited conventional capability will not be a sufficient deterrent. And so unless you have a strategic deterrent that will deter them from that, then everything else in the Department of Defense is simply going to get escalated past. And knowing what they're capable of doing is what causes you to come to that conclusion.
And our capability, our production capability is basically non-existent, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am, that's absolutely.
Especially when you compare it to China and Russia. Can you speak to that?
Both China and Russia have significant capability in their nuclear weapons complexes. I can give you the numbers in a closed session to produce more warheads. We are just barely able right now to life extend our weapons, and we're just starting to get to the point, we use the two terms interchangeably, just to be able to remanufacture the ones we have. We have no capability right now to actually make a new weapon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.